Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. In this first episode of the series dedicated to the analysis of historical manuals, we're going to discuss Filippo Vadi and his Arte Gladiatoria Dimicandi to help you understand what to expect if you want to approach its study from the very beginning. First of all, this manual talks about longsword, spear, dagger and wrestling in a context without armor, and about poleaxe and sword in armor. The sword which is meant to be used in armor is anyway a specific kind of sword, made especially for such kind of fighting practice. In fact, Maestro Vadi is far more specific than other masters while describing the kind of weapons you are going to use. Or better, he is one of the only masters that describe the dimensions of the weapons you are going to use. On his manual, you will find the dimensions of both the sword you are going to fight with, the one to fight in armor and the one meant to fight without the armor, and also a brief explanation of the dimensions of the dagger you're going to use. This aspect of the manual is very good as it helps a lot when it is time to choose or buy the sword you're going to use in your practice. The manual itself is a little cryptic, especially if compared to its predecessor, the Fior di Battaglia. The Arte Gladiatoria Dimicandi develops its main section, the one dedicated to longsword fighting, mainly textually. The largo part is in fact explained in verses, with only one image helping the student visualizing what is described in the book. In fact, the extensive use of text over images in fencing treatises is something that will become more and more common throughout the decades, especially after the advent of the press. Now, if you are interested in longsword, you will be happy because the longsword section is a third of the entire manual. Actually, the largo section of the longsword is a third of the entire manual. Now, unluckily, as I said, all of this is wrote in verses, which makes understanding it a little bit complex sometimes, and certain parts are rather cryptic, as I already said. This section contains a ton of useful details about basic cutting and thrusting, hints about techniques and how to chain together certain attacks. Vadi also goes through some broader concepts such as time and distance, which is not always common. He also gives a couple of minor pieces of advice in regards of footwork. Some techniques described are basically the same as the one we find in Fiore, such as the scambiare di punta, aka the exchange of thrusts, which we find described in chapter 3, Ragion di Spada. Other techniques are instead peculiar of Vadi, which together with his takes on footwork showcases a slightly different style of fencing, even if in line with the evolution of the Italian two-handed sword fighting style we find described throughout the centuries. The way of explaining concepts of Vadi is not that easy to get, especially in certain parts, and even for an Italian reader it sometimes requires multiple reads to have a proper grasp of what he says. His language is slightly more complex to deal with than the one used by Fiore, and there are on average a few more terms which require a little bit of research to be grasped properly. Partially because of this, Vadi is rarely studied by instructors and fencers here in Italy, especially if compared to other countries abroad, in which sometimes it is possible to find many instructors or even entire schools focusing on his teachings. Sometimes I even make jokes about the fact that Vadi is studied, translated and interpreted far more outside of Italy than here, due to the fact that while translating a text into another language, it is slightly easier to put order and meaning into it, even if sometimes it isn't very clear what the master actually meant in the first place. Stylistically speaking, Vadi's fencing looks like a hybrid between Fiore and Marozzo, something which doesn't surprise a lot considering that his work sits more or less in the middle of the others. Roughly 75 years after Fiore had his manuscript being made and 50 before Marozzo published his opera nova. This peculiarity related to his style, it is also noticeable in the guards showcased by the master himself, which sit in between the two of the other two masters. A few hints present in the largo section make you understand how to relate certain plays with the one in the section related to stretto, a section which is pretty wide and full of interesting techniques. And luckily, this doesn't happen very often, and the advice present in the glossa close to each drawing in this section is relatively small. In certain cases, the advice is easy to grasp, while other times is more cryptic to contextualize into proper fighting conditions. Long story short, the longsword stretto part of the manual is very interesting and with a lot of plays, but it requires a lot of experience to be understood. The Dagger section of Vadi is full of extremely interesting techniques, and some of them are even useful to understand even more in depth certain fiore techniques. But at the same time, Vadi lacks that clear organization of the plays which is present in fiore, which makes understanding the various plays a little bit harder. Now, if you don't know Fiore de Liberi, you have to know that in Fiore there are various dagger masters which are applying certain defenses, and from that kind of defenses you can then move forward and apply certain techniques on the opponent. In Vadi, this organization is not present, so the plays sometimes are well connected, while other times are hard to connect to each other, depending from case to case. While talking about the remaining sections, so the spear, the sword in armor and the Poleaxe in armor, they have a lot in common with the techniques which Maestro Fiore showcases in his manuals, and are on average easier to read and understand. Also because these sections are far shorter than all the other ones present in this book. All this considered, my idea of the Arte Gladiatoria Dimicandi is the one of a manual which requires an experienced instructor or an experienced fencer to be dealt with properly. Besides finding a good translation of the book, which definitely may help, it is best to have a grasp of either Fiore or Marozzo before approaching Vadi. It is fun enough easier to understand his work either by moving backward from Marozzo or forward from Fiore. It is instead far harder to understand what he has to say if approached directly. Fun enough. Vadi's book may be considered a specialist kind of book, with hints useful for experienced fencers, but explained in a rather cryptic way. Not the best manual to start with, but by far one of the most interesting and satisfying to unlock. Very good people, I hope you will find this video useful in some ways. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to check my Patreon, link in the description if you want to support me and the channel and if you want to see more of my content. Thanks for watching as always, and see you next time.